$2 of copper wire. Around your garden equals 0 slugs all season. Pesticide industry tried to ban this in 6 countries. $2 worth of copper wire laid around your garden beds creates an impenetrable force field that stops slugs and snails dead in their tracks more effectively than any pesticide ever manufactured. This simple technique, which involves nothing more than placing strips of copper around vulnerable plants, has been driving the pesticide industry absolutely crazy for decades because it works too well and costs too little. What I'm about to show you is a method so devastatingly effective against slugs that chemical companies have lobbied governments in 6 different countries to restrict copper use in gardens, claiming environmental concerns while protecting their billion-dollar slug bait market. But the real reason they want this method banned has nothing to do with environmental protection and everything to do with the fact that a $2 solution eliminates the need for their $8 to $15 toxic baits that need constant reapplication. The science behind why slugs literally cannot cross copper barriers will blow your mind. And once you understand the electrochemical reaction that occurs when slug slime meets copper metal, you'll never waste another penny on poison pellets that harm pets, birds, and beneficial insects while barely slowing down the slug invasion. The discovery of copper's slug-stopping power dates back to observations made by Victorian greenhouse keepers who noticed that slugs and snails would never cross the copper-lined gutters used to catch rainwater from glass roofs. These early gardeners didn't understand the science behind what they were seeing, but they knew that something about copper created an absolute barrier that slugs refused to cross. Word spread through gardening communities, and soon copper strips were being used throughout England and Scotland to protect valuable plants from slug damage. The chemical industry largely ignored this traditional method until the 1960s, when synthetic slug baits became big business. Suddenly, copper barriers were dismissed as old-fashioned superstition, even though they had been protecting gardens successfully for over a century. Marketing campaigns portrayed copper methods as unreliable and ineffective compared to modern chemical solutions. The truth is, the chemical companies needed copper barriers to seem primitive because they represented everything the industry feared: a permanent, non-toxic solution that never needed replacement. I first learned about copper barriers from an old German gardener named Klaus, who immigrated to America in the 1950s. His garden was surrounded by a continuous ring of copper strips that looked like decorative trim but served as an impenetrable defense against slugs. Klaus told me stories about his grandfather's garden in Bavaria, where copper gutters and downspouts created slug-free zones that lasted for generations. The copper aged and oxidized over time, but it never stopped working. Klaus's garden was legendary in our neighborhood. While everyone else battled devastating slug infestations that could strip a lettuce bed overnight, his vegetables grew untouched behind their copper fortifications. When I asked him where he bought his slug baits, he laughed and pointed to the copper strips. "Poison kills everything," he said. "Copper just sends them away." The science behind copper's anti-slug properties involves basic electrochemistry that occurs when slug slime contacts copper metal. Slugs secrete a mucus that contains salt and other electrolytes, creating a conductive solution. When this mucus touches copper, it forms a simple galvanic cell that generates a small electrical current. The slug experiences this as an uncomfortable shock that drives it away from the copper surface. This reaction isn't dangerous to the slug. It's more like touching a doorknob after walking across carpet on a dry day. But slugs have extremely sensitive nervous systems, and the electrical discharge is unpleasant enough that they actively avoid copper contact. The effect is immediate and consistent. unlike chemical deterrents that lose effectiveness over time or in wet conditions. The galvanic reaction between copper and slug mucus generates approximately 0.2 to 0.5 volts, which is barely detectable to human touch, but clearly perceptible to slug sensory organs. This voltage occurs because copper acts as a cathode, while the salt in slug slime creates an electrolytic solution, establishing the conditions for electrical current flow. The reaction continues as long as the slug maintains contact with copper, making it impossible for slugs to build tolerance or adapt to the deterrent. Research conducted at agricultural universities has documented this electrochemical response in controlled laboratory settings. When slugs are placed in chambers with copper strips, they consistently avoid copper contact while freely traversing other metal surfaces like aluminum or steel. The response is so reliable that it can be used to test slug sensitivity in research settings. But the pesticide industry doesn't want you to know any of this because copper barriers threaten their most profitable product lines. Slug baits and snail poisons generate over $200 million annually in retail sales across North America alone. These products require constant reapplication, especially after rain, creating a recurring revenue stream that lasts throughout the growing season. Copper barriers, once installed, work indefinitely without replacement or maintenance. A $10 investment in copper strips can protect a garden for decades, completely eliminating the need for chemical slug control. This permanence makes copper barriers economically devastating to companies whose business model depends on selling the same products over and over again. The attempted bans on copper in gardening applications reveal the industry's desperation to eliminate this competition. In France, chemical companies lobbied to classify copper plant protection as an industrial pollutant, requiring expensive permits for garden use. In Germany, proposed regulations would have limited copper strip length to amounts too small for effective garden protection. In Australia, efforts were made to restrict copper sales to licensed commercial applicators only. These regulatory attacks consistently failed because copper barriers pose no environmental risk and provide obvious benefits to organic growing operations. The same copper used in electrical wiring and plumbing poses no toxicity concerns when used as slug barriers in gardens. Unlike chemical baits that accumulate in soil and water systems, copper remains inert and causes no environmental contamination. Have you tried using copper strips or tape to control slugs in your garden? The installation of copper barriers requires attention to detail, but no special skills or tools. Continuous strips work best because slugs can find and exploit even small gaps in coverage. For raised beds, copper strips attached to the outside walls create effective perimeters that protect entire growing areas. Individual plants can be protected with copper rings placed around their base, creating personalized force fields for high-value specimens. The width of copper barriers affects their effectiveness, with wider strips providing more reliable protection than narrow ones. Strips less than 2 inches wide can sometimes be crossed by large slugs that stretch across the barrier without making full contact. Strips 4 inches or wider create zones that slugs cannot cross regardless of their size or species. Copper tape with adhesive backing provides the easiest installation option for most applications. This product, originally designed for electrical applications, adheres well to wood, plastic, and metal surfaces commonly used in garden construction. The adhesive holds copper firmly in place through multiple seasons of weather exposure, maintaining barrier integrity over time. Solid copper wire offers another installation option that works well for temporary or movable protection. Heavy gauge wire can be shaped into rings around individual plants or formed into larger perimeters that can be relocated as needed. Wire barriers require more careful installation to eliminate gaps, but they provide the flexibility that some garden layouts require. The cost comparison between copper barriers and chemical slug control strongly favors the permanent copper installation. 10 feet of copper tape costs approximately $5 and provides permanent protection for multiple raised beds. The same level of chemical protection requires $15 to $20 worth of slug baits per season, with treatments needed throughout the growing period. Copper's effectiveness extends beyond just slugs to include snails, which respond to the same electrochemical reaction. Both gastropod species produce mucus with similar electrolyte content that generates the galvanic response when contacting copper. Gardens protected with copper barriers typically become completely free of both slugs and snails within a single growing season. The speed of slug elimination varies with population density and alternative food sources, but most gardens show dramatic reductions in slug damage within 2 weeks of copper installation. Existing slug populations don't die from copper contact. They simply relocate to areas without copper barriers, often moving to neighboring properties that lack protection. If you're finding this copper barrier information useful, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to help more gardeners discover this simple solution. Weather resistance represents one of copper's major advantages over chemical alternatives. Rain immediately dissolves and dilutes chemical slug baits, requiring reapplication after every significant precipitation. Copper barriers become more effective in wet conditions because moisture enhances the electrical conductivity that creates the deterrent response. The oxidation of copper over time actually improves its slug deterrent properties rather than reducing them. Fresh copper generates the strongest electrical response, but even heavily oxidized copper continues producing enough galvanic reaction to repel slugs effectively. The green patina that develops on outdoor copper doesn't interfere with the electrochemical process that creates slug deterrence. Maintenance requirements for copper barriers are minimal compared to chemical control programs. Occasional cleaning to remove dirt buildup maintains optimal electrical contact, but copper strips continue working even when partially covered with soil or debris. Chemical programs require careful timing, weather monitoring, and frequent product replacement to maintain effectiveness. The environmental benefits of copper barriers extend beyond eliminating toxic chemical applications. Slug baits containing metaldehyde or iron phosphate pose serious risks to pets, birds, and beneficial insects that consume poisoned slugs. Dogs and cats are particularly vulnerable to slug bait toxicity, with emergency veterinary treatment often required after accidental consumption. Copper barriers pose no toxicity risks to any animals, including the slugs themselves. The electrical deterrent causes discomfort but no permanent harm, allowing slug populations to relocate rather than die. This approach maintains ecological balance while protecting gardens from slug damage. The selectivity of copper barriers provides another advantage over broad-spectrum chemical treatments. Slug baits affect many non-target species, including ground beetles, salamanders, and other beneficial garden predators. Copper barriers affect only gastropods, allowing beneficial species to thrive while excluding only the pest species. Organic certification programs readily approve copper barriers for slug control while restricting or prohibiting many chemical alternatives. Copper's natural occurrence and non-toxic properties make it compatible with organic growing standards that emphasize environmental sustainability and biological pest management. The long-term effectiveness of copper barriers improves over time as slug populations learn to avoid protected areas. Young slugs hatching near copper-protected gardens quickly encounter the barriers and relocate to unprotected areas. This conditioning effect creates expanding zones of slug-free gardening as populations adapt their behavior patterns. Commercial growing operations increasingly use copper barriers for high-value crops, where slug damage creates significant economic losses. Greenhouse operations particularly benefit from copper barriers because the controlled environment maximizes the electrochemical response while eliminating weather variables that affect chemical treatments. The scalability of copper protection allows implementation from container gardens to large agricultural operations. Small gardens can be completely protected with minimal copper investment, while larger operations can use copper strategically around vulnerable crops or newly planted areas where slug damage is most devastating. Installation timing affects the speed of slug population reduction, but doesn't determine long-term effectiveness. Copper barriers installed before slug eggs hatch in spring prevent establishment of breeding populations. Barriers installed during active slug periods provide immediate protection while forcing existing populations to relocate. The combination of copper barriers with other integrated pest management strategies creates comprehensive slug control systems that eliminate chemical dependence entirely. Habitat modification, beneficial predator encouragement, and cultural practices work synergistically with copper barriers to create slug-resistant garden ecosystems. Problem solving for copper barrier failures usually reveals installation gaps rather than product ineffectiveness. Slugs are remarkably good at finding small openings in barrier systems, exploiting gaps as narrow as half an inch to access protected areas. Careful inspection and gap elimination typically restore full barrier effectiveness. The electrical conductivity of copper varies with alloy composition, affecting deterrent strength against different slug species. Pure copper provides the strongest galvanic response, while copper alloys containing zinc or other metals may show reduced effectiveness. Electrical-grade copper wire and roofing copper provide optimal slug deterrence because of their high purity levels. Soil contact doesn't diminish copper's slug deterrent properties as long as the metal surface remains accessible to slug contact. Buried copper continues generating electrical responses when slugs attempt to cross over or burrow under barrier installations. This subsurface effectiveness prevents slugs from tunneling around above-ground barriers. The temperature dependence of galvanic reactions means copper barriers work more effectively in warm, moist conditions when slugs are most active. Cold weather reduces both slug activity and electrical conductivity, but barriers remain functional throughout the temperature ranges when slug damage typically occurs. Regional effectiveness studies show consistent copper barrier performance across different climate zones and soil types. Humid coastal areas, dry inland regions, and temperate continental climates all report similar success rates with copper slug control. This universal effectiveness contrasts with chemical methods that show variable results depending on local conditions. The integration of copper barriers with companion planting strategies creates multi-layered defense systems against slug damage. Plants that naturally repel slugs, combined with copper barriers, provide redundant protection that ensures garden security, even if one method experiences temporary failure. Educational institutions teaching sustainable agriculture increasingly emphasize copper barriers over chemical treatments in their pest management curricula. The permanent nature, environmental safety, and economic advantages of copper make it an ideal teaching tool for demonstrating ecological pest control principles. The innovation potential in copper barrier design continues expanding as more gardeners discover the technique's effectiveness. Decorative copper strips, Integrated copper planters and architectural copper elements provide aesthetic solutions that combine beauty with slug protection. These applications show how effective pest control doesn't require ugly or utilitarian installations. Quality differences between copper products affect both cost and performance, making product selection important for optimal results. Thin copper tape may not provide adequate electrical contact or weather resistance for long-term garden use. Heavy-gauge copper strips or wire ensure reliable performance and justify their slightly higher initial cost through extended service life. The recycling value of copper provides economic recovery options when garden layouts change or barriers need replacement. Unlike chemical products that create only waste disposal costs, copper barriers retain material value that can offset replacement expenses. This recyclability adds to copper's environmental advantages over disposable chemical alternatives. Professional landscape installations increasingly specify copper barriers for client properties where slug damage threatens valuable plantings. The permanent nature and maintenance-free operation of copper make it attractive for landscapes where ongoing chemical treatment would be expensive and disruptive. The education curve for implementing copper barriers is minimal compared to chemical treatment programs that require understanding of application timing, weather restrictions, and safety protocols. Copper installation requires only basic measurement and cutting skills, making the technique accessible to gardeners of all experience levels. The seasonal independence of copper barriers eliminates the timing concerns that complicate chemical slug control programs. Barriers installed once provide protection throughout the growing season and beyond, regardless of weather patterns or seasonal slug population cycles. Consumer testimonials consistently report higher satisfaction rates with copper barriers than chemical alternatives, citing effectiveness, safety, and cost savings as primary advantages. These user experiences have driven word-of-mouth promotion that threatens chemical industry market share more effectively than any advertising campaign. The future of slug control appears to be moving toward copper and other non-chemical alternatives as environmental awareness increases and chemical resistance develops in slug populations. Copper barriers represent a proven, permanent solution that aligns with sustainable gardening principles while providing superior protection at lower cost. Research into optimizing copper barrier design continues revealing improvements in effectiveness and ease of installation. Studies of conductor spacing, surface treatments, and alloy compositions provide data for developing even more effective copper barrier systems. The resistance movement against chemical slug control has found its symbol in the simple copper strip. As more gardeners discover the effectiveness and economy of copper barriers, the market for expensive chemical treatments continues declining. This grassroots adoption threatens industry profits more effectively than any regulatory action. Have you been spending money on slug pellets when a one-time copper investment could solve the problem permanently? Share your slug control experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear whether you've tried copper barriers and what results you've seen. If this information about copper barriers has opened your eyes to a better way of controlling slugs, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Your support helps me continue exposing these simple, effective alternatives to expensive chemical products that often don't work as well as traditional methods. Together, we can help fellow gardeners save money while protecting their plants more effectively with copper barriers instead of toxic baits that harm pets and wildlife.